relationship with China on Hong Kong as well. Just a few hours ago, British television audiences saw an edition of the BBC's Panorama programme devoted entirely to China. And immediately afterwards, an edition of Newsnight, including a live studio discussion between an audience in London and in this studio here in Hong Kong. We now bring you that programme exactly as it was seen in Britain, free from interruptions.
The events in China have provoked outrage across the world and alarm in Hong Kong. In 8 years' time, on July the 1st, 1997, this British colony will be handed back to China under the terms of an agreement signed 5 years ago. There are 1 million people in 3 million.
Special relationship with China on Hong Kong as well. Just a few hours ago, British television audiences saw an edition of the BBC's Panorama programme devoted entirely to China. And immediately afterwards, an edition of Newsnight, including a live studio discussion between an audience in London and in this studio here in Hong Kong. We now bring you that programme exactly as it was seen in Britain, free from interruptions.
The events in China have provoked outrage across the world and alarm in Hong Kong. In 8 years' time, on July the 1st, 1997, this British colony will be handed back to China under the terms of an agreement signed 5 years ago. There are 5.5 million people in Hong Kong, over 3 million of whom are British subjects, who now, more than ever, want the right to settle in Britain. So far, however, the government has insisted that only a small fraction of them will be allowed to come. Yet now, powerful voices in this country have declared that after what's happened in the last few weeks, the government must think again, that it has an overriding moral obligation to the people of Hong Kong, and that for us, the British, this is a matter of honour. Tonight, we will hear the case from Hong Kong addressed to us and to the Foreign Secretary. In turn, Sir Geoffrey Howe will explain the government's present position, not only to the people of Hong Kong, but to an audience in this studio, a cross-section of the men and women of Britain who could tell him to change his mind. Sir Geoffrey, after the bloodshed, a simple question to you. Why are you not now prepared to give to the British nationals of Hong Kong the right of abode here, an insurance policy against what could happen to them?
Well, the answer to that directly, of course, is that if one is granting an insurance policy, you have to assume that every one of the policyholders will claim his insurance, all 3.25 million of them. And it has not been our judgment that one could commend legislation to that effect to the House of Commons. One cannot grant an insurance policy on the off chance that it won't happen. It's very important to put all this in a longer perspective. I noticed in your introduction you said it was to be handed back under an agreement arrived at 5 years ago. Of course, it's a much deeper problem than that, because the territory was held by us under a lease which expires in 1997. And it was the conclusion of all of us that we had to try and reach an agreement to prolong the prospects of Hong Kong's prosperity beyond that, because we couldn't challenge the expiry of the lease. And the agreement was one that we drew up after very, very long negotiations, receiving the close advice of the representatives and Legislative Council in Hong Kong. When we arrived at it in 1984, it was universally acclaimed and welcomed as offering the very best prospect for the future of Hong Kong. Now, the tragedy of the events of the last few weeks has been the extent to which all that has been cast engraved out, and I fully understand the deep anxieties of the people of Hong Kong in face of the brutality, first of all in Peking, and now the widespread and sustained oppression. I fully understand that. I fully understand why they ask for what you've asked me about. But in the context of British nationality policy over the years, we do not judge that it would be acceptable to the House of Commons to present them with the proposition that 3.25 million people should be granted the prospect, which has to be regarded as a realistic one, of coming to this country to settle.
Why can you not offer them that prospect? Why would it be unacceptable to the House of Commons?
Because if you put it in the context of the whole way in which we've had to develop our immigration policy since the end of the war, when the British Empire first emerged into the post-war scene, there were literally hundreds of millions of people around the world who could claim the right to settle here as of right. And in contrast to countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, which have been in the business of attracting immigrants continuously over many centuries indeed, Britain's task has been to restrict the numbers of people who could theoretically come here. And in 1981, long before this agreement was arrived at, the House of Commons then decided quite plainly that we could not continue to extend to the British passport holders in Hong Kong the right of settlement or abode in this country.
But, Foreign Secretary, you have acknowledged the situation is now different. Indeed, the very man with whom you did that deal, signed that agreement, now has, not to put it too crudely, blood on his hands. He is the agent of the pogrom, of the killing that we saw. He authorized it. So my question to you again is, why, under those circumstances, can you not say that they can come? And may I, in that context, to direct your attention to one of the things that you said in the House of Commons, ask you why it is so important to you that maybe, and I quote you, the result would be to more than double the ethnic minority population of the United Kingdom. This was not to do with numbers, but the ethnic minority.
Because the whole fabric of our legislation as it has developed in relation to immigration control has necessarily been related to the people from the Commonwealth who would originally and otherwise obtain the right to come here. And one of the reasons why that control has been regarded not merely as justifiable, but as absolutely essential, is in order to minimize the risks of ethnic conflict within our own country.
What you are saying, with respect, Sir Geoffrey, is that you believe the British population would not tolerate this arrival, that there is enough racial feeling amongst us to make that not a political option. Do I understand you correctly?
Let me put it more directly than that.
Yes.
The whole of our legislation designed to control Commonwealth immigration, at one time, a matter of deep controversy, has been accepted by successive governments as a necessary feature in a crowded island like our own, if we're not to have the tensions arising from a large, growing and unpredictable ethnic minority. That has been the basis. And if one was to contemplate the possibility, and one has to contemplate the possibility, of adding to that ethnic minority a figure larger than the total already here, that is a potential cause of social tension which one cannot disregard.
Let me then come back to you again, no less bluntly. What you are saying by inference is that if these people were white Anglo-Saxons, or indeed white Europeans, who incidentally have freedom of access here in any case now as a result of the common market, or will have increasingly, it would be okay.
No.
It's the colour of their skin.
No, not in the least, because our Commonwealth immigration changes have progressively affected people regardless of their colour.
Yes, but you've just defined the problem, not in terms of the change of law exclusively, but in terms of the possible social unrest that follows from it. Now, you're not proposing that there would be social unrest with Australians or Canadians. You're proposing that it's because these people are Chinese ethnically.
But supposing millions of people from any of the other territories were to claim the same right, the same kind of problems would arise. They arise with particular sharpness in this case, and this is the case that was accepted by the House of Commons in 1981.
And you are not prepared to contemplate, Foreign Secretary, that under these circumstances, what was accepted in 1981 may not be tolerable to a tolerant British society and therefore subject to possible change.
Yes, let me again present the thing to you directly. I do not wish to be put here, as it were, being charged or cross-examined by you, as though I'm insensitive to these matters. During the whole of my time as Foreign Secretary, a great deal of my energy and effort has been directed to trying to establish a secure prospect for the people of Hong Kong. But I fully understand the depth of their anguish in face of the events that have now happened. I fully understand why they make now the case that they have made in earlier circumstances. But the fact is that to have a case made on that scale would be to test the tolerant hospitality of the British public, I think, to a point that it would not be prudent to commend to the House of Commons. Now, if we go beyond that, we have, of course, indicated, in light of the events that have happened, that there is scope for some consideration within the limits of the existing law on that. We've also indicated that there are other considerations which I know are deeply concerning the people of Hong Kong, namely the pace at which changes should take place in their constitutions there. So there are many things yet to discuss.
Foreign Secretary, I certainly do not seek to charge you with anything. I ask the questions that are in the public mind and have been much aired, as you know, in the editorials of most of our newspapers. Let me pick you up on just those two last points you made, particularly the one about changing the present arrangements of the Act, the flexibility with which you might let people come in. That has prompted the response that, yes, that's fine. If you happen to have enough money, maybe you'll reduce the amount of money. If you happen to work for the government or be an ex-service person, yes, you'll get in. But at the end, you're still saying some will get in, but the majority won't.
Well, those are the categories under existing legislation which prevail in quite different circumstances, not just in relation to Hong Kong. Those are the categories which already exist and which therefore form the basis from which any consideration should start.
You don't want people to run away with the idea that this flexibility will increase to the extent that everyone will be embraced. It's still going to be a very small proportion, however you increase those categories.
The conclusions on that have yet to be arrived at. It's a matter for consideration.
Very well.
But I think the important point to recognize is that the legislation as it exists was shaped with sensible purposes in mind. I fully acknowledge why people should be seeking to question it now, but I do believe that it would be very difficult to invite the House of Commons to accept a change along the lines and on the scale that is currently being canvassed.
As I understand you then, and you've been very unambiguous about it, Foreign Secretary, the concern that one might have, House of Commons might have about racial tension and racial conflict in this country overrides any obligation in the respect of sanctuary which you might otherwise wish to exercise. Which leads me to one final point before we'll be talking again later in the programme. The Prime Minister says, we have a commitment to the secure future of the people of Hong Kong. What you really mean by that commitment, if I've interpreted you accurately, is that you can't actually fulfill the commitment in respect of that security, but you hope things will be all right.
Well, our commitment has been to Hong Kong, not only to its people, and that commitment, of course, has had to be built upon the inescapable facts of geography and history. Hong Kong, the territory, Hong Kong, its people, are a tiny proportion of the land mass and people mass of China. And it's on those facts that we have sought to arrive at an agreement. Indeed, we did arrive at an agreement with the government of China, an internationally binding agreement, widely acclaimed, on which to build the future of Hong Kong.
Which in some, Foreign Secretary, and this is not a charge against you, it is your judgment that the House of Commons believes that the British people are too racialist in their outlook to allow the moral considerations about what might happen to the people of Hong Kong to override that concern.
Now, I don't accept, if I may say so, that crude and emotional way of putting it. What I'm saying is that any society has a limit to the pace at which it can absorb people, and the more strange they are to the society, the more difficult it is to accept them. Other societies have the same kind of pattern of legislation, and I believe that if the House of Commons is to be invited to extend a commitment to 3.25 million people from Hong Kong, from a totally different background, then it has to be invited to do so on the basis that they may all claim that right. I know that it's comforting to argue that we can do it as an insurance policy, because it may never happen. That would be the height of irresponsibility. We have to address ourselves to the prospect as a reality, and it's for that reason that we form the judgment that we do.
There are different ways of saying perhaps the same thing, perhaps different things, Foreign Secretary, but we have there certainly heard the government's position. A case not only put to us in Britain then, but also to Hong Kong, where the programme is also being broadcast. So let's now go to the Hong Kong studio, where David Walter is there with a group of British subjects, citizens of the Crown Colony, who've been listening to what the Foreign Secretary has just been saying. David, I think it would be, if you could, useful, first of all, to hear from our guests with you why they believe they need that right to come here, and then perhaps the answers to some of the things that the Foreign Secretary has been saying.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I wonder if I can ask you all first a question, and I think from the expressions on your faces there may not be much doubt about the answer to this question. How many people here, on a show of hands, feel that Hong Kong people with British passports ought to have the right of entry to Britain? I see a show of hands. That seems to be pretty unanimous. Now, Joyce Wong, I wonder if I can come to you first. You're a solicitor, and I know that you feel very strongly about this question. What have you got to say to the British people about this question to persuade them of the justice of your case?
Well, I feel, listening to Sir Geoffrey today, he has reinforced the feeling that I have, and I'm sure the feeling that the people in Hong Kong have, of the tremendous sense of betrayal that this British government is conveying to the people here. I think it's a tremendous injustice to the British people. He says that he feels that this the changes in the law will not pass through Parliament. He doesn't even consider putting forward any alternative legislation to this Nationality Act, listening to him today. And as for the suggestion that special segments of society here in Hong Kong, who are all 3.2 million of them are BDTC holders, should be allowed favour from the British government of their rights of abode in Hong Kong, in the UK, it's morally repugnant.
Thank you very much indeed. Jack Edwards, can I come to you? And yes. You have lived here for 20 years, but you've also lived in Britain. You surely understand the problems in Britain.
Yes.
What have you got to say to this question?
I've got to say this. I hold here the flag, which was put up in Hong Kong, August the 18th, 1945, by men who risked their lives for freedom, liberty, and democracy. My remarks out to the servicemen. This flag was flown here before the British fleet arrived by very brave men. This flag represents, supposedly, justice, liberty. Neville Chamberlain, when he came back, just like Sir Geoffrey Howe, waved a piece of paper to us in 1939. He said, I hold here a sacred document. That was given by a dictator. We were marching in uniform in no time. I say to Sir Geoffrey Howe, you will go down in history like Neville Chamberlain. And I warn Mrs. Thatcher also that somebody one day will say, depart, I say, in the name of God, go. Let us have done with you. Because, quite frankly, you are putting these people in the face of death and injury by your actions.
Thank you very much indeed. Cecilia Shea, you're one of the people most affected by this. You have one of these passports, but you at the moment don't have the right to enter Britain. Why should you have that right?
Yes, because we are the Hong Kong people. Britain is the sovereign state, like the stepmother of the Hong Kong people. So we have the right to secure the resident after 1997.
Are you afraid what would happen to you if you didn't have that right?
Yes.
What do you think would happen?
I think I will leave Hong Kong if I find another way, if I don't have the right.
So where would you go?
Somewhere in the world, the free world.
Because there are some people who would say, well, perhaps the judgment of what's been going on in Beijing is too precipitate. Of course, it is a tragic event which has happened there. Nonetheless, even in the darkest days of Mao's time, he still left Hong Kong untouched, that it's the goose that lays the golden eggs, and some people say China will never touch it, whatever the circumstances. Mr. Lee, you've actually been in Beijing, haven't you? What happened to you there?
I was detained in Beijing for 3 days. And the reason for the detention is because I represent groups in Hong Kong to carry money to Beijing to support the student in Beijing. And I was interrogated and was asked to write a confession that I was wrong in contacting the student groups, the student leaders. And they always repeat one thing, is that if I explain clearly everything, then I can leave. And secondly, when you look at the TV in China and also the explanation from the people who interrogate me, is that the student movement now is counter-revolutionary rioter. And also they emphasize that they are overseas power in supporting the student.
And you fear that the same thing might happen in Hong Kong once it was handed over to China?
I think, you know, when you look at the history of China, this is not the first time that a purge of the people in China. And I think all the people in Hong Kong is worried in the future that something similar will happen to them. And actually, I think the fear is very well grounded, because it's not just me who have been detained at this moment. I think there are other people of Hong Kong that are now being detained in China. And also, historically, lots of people who came to Hong Kong have been detained in the past history.
So, Trini Leung, you're a fellow trade unionist of Mr. Lee. Could you not look to some support from the British government?
Yes, actually, beginning the morning immediately after the massacre, for 2 days we tried desperately to call up the British Embassy in Beijing and asking for help and to send us safely back to Hong Kong. And when we first called up, then the question immediately put to us is, are you traveling on a British passport? And when I said no, then the British Embassy officials said, well, then I'm afraid we won't be able to help you, meaning that we're not quite considered as British. But then when we said, actually, some of our Hong Kong students might be in danger of arrest by the Chinese authorities. And then the official said, well, maybe you should have thought twice when you want to interfere with others' internal affairs.
This is something that people might feel in Britain, that however much they sympathize with you, you are basically Chinese. It's not Britain that has caused all this trouble for you, it's China. The solution lies with China, not with Britain.
Yes, but I think, you know, in Hong Kong, we definitely feel Chinese, and that's why we want to make Hong Kong our home. And but our political future is a question of life and death. You know, we cannot afford the luxury which preoccupy the minds of the British politician or even some of the British people of only considering the narrow partisan interests or even narrow British economic interests. Our future is a question of life and death. And especially after the whole incident in Beijing now, when we saw the troops firing shots at pedestrians just because they criticized the government, but which is the thing we're used to in Hong Kong. We're used to handing petitions or signatures or staging hunger strike. You know, it is nothing extraordinary for the people of Hong Kong. But you know, we fear that if we do it in our future, would we also be faced by tanks?
Can we move on to Mr. Chung, and perhaps you could explain Mr. Chung's situation, because I understand he's a refugee from an earlier upheaval in China.
Yes, Mr. Chung, he went through the first part of the Cultural Revolution, and I think life was so unbearable.
We should explain that he doesn't speak English.
Yes, and Mr. Chung is a worker, and he's on the committee of the Christian Industrial Committee, and he only speaks Cantonese, so he might be able to tell more of the story about, you know, what
yes,
he's
I think the question that I'd really like to ask Mr. Chung is, are you frightened now about your situation?
Definitely, I'm very afraid.
就我所知道嘅。 就喺而家中共嗰個從嚟嗰個政權就強調啊，槍桿子啊促政權，佢揸住槍啊就促政權，佢而家到今時今日都係咁樣，所以我哋好擔心將來。
Mr. Zhang insists that the Chinese Communist Party upholds the principle of that the regime comes from the barrel of the gun. And he has never given up the arms.
Bishop, can I turn to you? You're the Bishop of Hong Kong and Macau. How do you feel about this point, which Sir Geoffrey is implicitly suggesting, that British people just couldn't cope with 3.5 million people coming into Britain? It's too many people at once.
I don't think this is a matter of number, but it's a matter of the moral responsibility, which the British always try to honor. And I think that in the history of Britain, they accommodate the people from Gibraltar and accommodate the people from Falkland Islands.
But there are far many more of you, aren't there?
Well, I think that 3 million and a quarter million is, most of them would not be going to England, and at least 1/3 of them would be settling in other countries, and most of them don't want to leave Hong Kong.
But what Sir Geoffrey says is that if you offer an insurance policy, you have to take the risk that everybody will take it up.
And of course, we have to take that point, but I think that Hong Kong is a good example, because in the last 40 years, Hong Kong has taken in a lot of refugees, and all those refugees have helped to build up Hong Kong. It's not destroying Hong Kong, but rather to try to build Hong Kong.
Perhaps I can ask your neighbour, Mr. McGregor, you're a member of LegCo, the Legislative Council here. Can you not accept the point that it is politically impossible, or at least very difficult, for Britain to accept quite so many people?
I don't believe so, because among other things, Britain is at the moment committed in 1992 to accepting, if they wish to go, 200 million Europeans with free movement throughout the market. What is 3.25 million against 200 million people? I think is a very small proportion. Secondly, I think that Britain and the British people, I have a feeling that Hong Kong is at the moment in the same situation as Britain was immediately after Dunkirk, where they were alone and looking for a friend, and America became the friend and helped Britain. I think Hong Kong is now in the situation where we are asking the mother country to extend us a lifeline, which I think is well within British capability.
Martin Lee, you're another member of the Legislative Council. Can I ask you, Sir Geoffrey did seem to give at least a glimmer of hope there that democracy would be speeded up in Hong Kong. Now, you're somebody who's campaigned very hard for that in the past. Doesn't that give you some satisfaction, at least?
Well, giving us democracy now and not passports to get away in case it doesn't work, and bearing in mind that People's Liberation Army will be stationed in Hong Kong, and bearing in mind what they did to the people of China who want democracy, is giving us death.
So it's too late now just to have democracy. The principal question for you is the right of entry.
I think Sir Geoffrey should realize that if passports are given to us, then there is an obligation on the part of Great Britain to make a future work. In other words, to make sure that we have a future so that we do not cash in on those policies. But now, he doesn't give passports. He therefore doesn't even try to give us a future.
Peter Wong, can I ask you, you're a prominent businessman here, and you must understand the economic realities of this. It seems that there would be very considerable racial tensions, in Geoffrey Howe's view, if this right of entry was granted.
Well, personally, I don't think so. Because in the business community, I think that one of the things which we have contributed to the Sino-British Agreement is trying to maintain the prosperity and stability of Hong Kong through our business activities. And this is really across all the races. But I think the current event really shatters the beliefs which we have had built in the past 10 years. Now, without this right of abroad, I think it certainly would make the Hong Kong situation, immigration situation, deteriorate. And from the business sector, I think it would be very difficult for us to maintain our men in our companies, and hence pretty difficult for us to contribute in the transition state to maintain the business activities.
But can you understand these very strong feelings over a large number of years about the subject of immigration in Britain? Is there anything that you can say to the British people to persuade them away from their current view?
Well, I believe in the past few days, especially when this atrocity in China prevails, there's strong sentiment in the British public, as we hear from Hong Kong, suggested that the previous policy has got to be reviewed.
Robert Tang, what's your view? You're from the Hong Kong Bar Association.
May I pose this question first? Is it right to hand over Hong Kong to China? when it is no longer reasonable to believe that the Chinese government will keep their promise under the Joint Declaration, and without giving the people of Hong Kong a possibility of refuge. I believe when one is deciding what is right and wrong, one should not flinch from the consequence. Theoretically, several million Hong Kong people may resettle in Britain. However, the answer to the question should not depend on one's perception as to how likely or remote is that possibility. The Foreign Secretary said in the House of Commons on the 6th of June, in connection with the proposed visit by the Prince and Princess of Wales to China, that the visit, and I quote, clearly cannot take place so long as those responsible for the atrocities over the past weekend remain in control of the Chinese government. Just as the visit cannot take place, I believe Britain must not deliver Hong Kong to a government which is responsible for those atrocities without offering the people of Hong Kong a possibility of refuge.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin Lee, can I come back to you? Do you feel that there is basically some form of racism at the back of Britain's attitude?
I think it's implicit in Sir Geoffrey's answers earlier. He put it in very diplomatic language, of course, but to me it's one word, racialist. Can you imagine, and I'd like to put this question to Sir Geoffrey, handing over 5.5 million people to China who are deemed to be counter-revolutionary. It's like handing over 5.5 million Jews to Nazi Germany during the Second World War when they were born in the British territory.
David Walter. David, can we just
We have a question from Jonathan, yes.
Could we just pause there, David, because we've heard a number of passionately made statements and also arguments as well. The reaction of the people to Hong Kong, to what Sir Geoffrey has had to say. But it is not just a matter for the Hong Kong and the British government. It's a question also for the British people as well. Do we accept the government's view, or are we impressed by the case from Hong Kong? The audience we've invited here is a cross-section of the British population, selected for us by the opinion pollsters Mori. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hear some of your reactions to what you've heard. And I'm going to go to you more or less at random. So what is your view?
Well, I don't think they should come here.
I beg your pardon?
I don't think they should be allowed here.
Why do you say that after what you've heard?
Because how can we house them? Where are they going to live?
Well, how do we house them? Where do they live? So your view?
I've asked quite a few people today when I knew I was coming on this program. And one was a man from Hong Kong, a Mr. Chang. And I said to him, do you think it's right for 3.5 million people to come into this country? And he straight away said no. The reason he said no, not because he doesn't like his own countrymen. We had a big discussion about this, and it was, where are you going to put them? I worked out that 3.5 million beds, 6 feet long, and 6 foot the other way, so you've got a space to get out, will occupy 4 square miles.
Thank you, sir. I'll go up to the back there, if I could. Gentleman in the back row, about 5 in. Yes,
Yes, my initial view was that we should honour it's a British passport. However, I agree with Sir Geoffrey that once you give them the right, the thought of 3.25 million people coming into this country horrifies me.
What about the thought that was also put from Hong Kong, that one of the consequences of giving the right will make it much less likely that people will need to exercise the insurance policy, and we're not really dealing with a Gadarene rush of 3.5 million people?
It's a hypothetical at that point. You can't take the chance.
So, your view? Just below.
Of course we should honour our obligation. Of course we should. And with regards to insurance, this country makes a great deal of money out of insurance.
Why do you not find yourself responsive to the sorts of point that the gentleman down here was making about the numbers? We simply can't absorb the numbers.
A British passport is a British passport, however it's couched. It's an obligation.
Sir, next door.
Yes, I would agree with the man next door to me. I think that the time is, we have enough time to plan for it to happen. It's 5 years away, or whatever it is, more than that. We need to get things moving now. It becomes a European issue as well, because those people, if they have the right to come here, have the right to go within the EEC as well. And we need to ask our European partners how they can help plan for it as well.
Madam down here, just in the front.
Well, I think it's our duty to do something. We should find an alternative.
Should find
There
an
has to
alternative.
be another way.
Yes, the gentleman at the back with the red tie and the green and white shirt.
Yes, I find it absolutely deplorable listening to some of the comments made. I believe the situation is akin to what the Jews faced in Germany circa 1934. And I believe it is up to the international community to internationalize the situation.
To internationalise the situation. You want the British government to deal either through the UN or the EC and America to try and get a conglomerate of countries prepared to give the guarantee. Is that what you're suggesting?
Either to give the guarantees of exit, or either, like we've done with Taiwan, a military guarantee.
Thank you. Madam, down here, what's your view?
No, I don't think they should be allowed in. It's far too small an island, and it would be a terrible burden on the taxpayer.
Are there other views similar to that here? Yes, gentleman immediately behind.
I think that it is an inescapable moral obligation, and as for the favourable future negotiated for Hong Kong, I'd like to ask Sir Geoffrey what he thought that Jardine Matheson thought of it.
Can you expand on that thought? What do you think Jardine Matheson thought of it?
Well, I think they thought they had no future in Hong Kong once it ceased to be a British colony.
Now, the question was raised by Sir Geoffrey about flexibility, about extending somewhat the constraints of the Nationality Act in order to increase the numbers that would come in, although by his own account only by a small proportion. Any views on that particular thing? Sir, down here.
I wouldn't let any of them come in. If they got the money, they stay where they are. Because to bring all that over it, it's going to cost millions of pounds. What about food, schools, housing? Nobody's thought of that. Where are they going to live?
There's the gentleman with the blue and white sweater on.
I'm sorry, I believe we have a moral obligation. I don't see that we can afford to take Sir Geoffrey's view, which to some extent he's a prisoner of his own extreme right-wing immigration policies. We have a duty to honour the Hong Kong citizens. I don't think it's going to cause too much problem. Last year, only 800 came to Britain, 11,000 went to Canada. I think this nation can cope with it. I think the problems are being exaggerated.
Thank you. The lady at the back with the blonde hair and red dress.
I think it's not so much a matter of honour as a matter of practicality. And it doesn't seem to be very practical, but I rather agree with the gentleman next to me that there could be an international assessment of the situation and maybe an international solution.
But that might...
Because they want more a right of exit, I would have thought, than a right of entry.
What about if there isn't that option? Do you believe then that that isn't some kind of cop-out? If the international community says, sorry, your problem, Sir Geoffrey.
Importing misery is not a solution, and I think that there would be big problems having so many people immigrate.
Gentleman down here at the front. Yes.
I'd love to, invite them people over here because we know what's going on over there, like people being killed. But has anybody stopped to think of the amount of people who are homeless in this country now? And you're trying to bring in more people who's going to make it a lot worse than what it is now.
What would your reaction to the point that was made repeatedly there, that if the debt, if you like, as they would see it, is not honoured, then down the road we could be witnessing on our television screens, as we've been witnessing, similar things happening, but to those people who at the moment have the right to that British passport?
I mean, personally myself, I would love to see us hand over to the UN. So it would be an old... Everybody could take some of them and help them out, because I don't think there's too many of them to come into this country, and we're not going to be able to help anyone, and it's not up to us to choose the ones who come into this country.
Is there anyone else who wants to add something to what's been said here? Yes, the lady second, no, not sir, the lady who's got red lipstick on, second row down. Madam.
I mean, I think it's fine for the British to say hurrah, hurrah, rule Britannia and go marching off across the world and having battles and gaining countries. They do have an obligation to people who have lived under the British rule, so to speak. They look to England as the mother country, And I think it's quite easy for England to say that we can't cope with the racial problems already, but it's the people within England who have to accept other people who they have taken under their wing in the past.
Gentleman just behind you on the left.
As I see it, with this very difficult situation in China, I think my advice to the Hong Kong people would be run like this. I think they'd be very much better off to stay put, because I think China is actually under dictatorship at the moment, you know. And I would say to the Hong Kong people that stay put until China stabilizes a democratic government.
Got the point, sir. I've got the point, sir, and I think you clearly expressed it, and I'm going to ask you to pause there because I want to now move to ask you all, as you do represent the British public, so far as the pollsters are concerned, just to get us some idea of where you stand. We've heard a mixture of views from you. Could I ask those who believe that the British government should give right of entry, right of abode in this country to those citizens of Hong Kong, those passport holders, to raise their hands for me? And now those who believe that that right should not be given to those citizens. And I would like to see, are there any don't knows among those? We have 2 don't knows. My clear assessment of that, perhaps rather surprisingly, is that a clear majority of you believe that the people of Hong Kong should be allowed to come here. And I just briefly want to go back to Hong Kong, if I could. David, we had a very clear view there of this audience, which we think is representative, that a majority should come. Can you just give a quick response there from the people of Hong Kong?
Yes, I should tell you there was a loud ripple of applause when that vote was taken here. Perhaps I could put the question to Martin Lee. What's your response to the views expressed and to that vote that was taken?
I'm very encouraged by it. It in fact supports what I've been saying, thinking all the time, that the people in Great Britain are honourable, but not the government.
David, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to come back here now to Sir Geoffrey. You heard what the people said in that audience, Sir Geoffrey. You heard what was said in Hong Kong. You saw that vote. We don't pretend that that is a precise referendum. However, it is a clear reflection that a large number of people do share the view that the people of Hong Kong should be allowed to come in here. In the light of that, and in the light of what you said about the anxieties concerning doubling potentially the ethnic minority of this country, do you think perhaps you may have rushed to judgment, misjudged the temper of the British people, the sense of honour that they have?
I think not. No, I can think that it's very understandable that an audience of this kind, assembled in a programme of this kind, presented with the case in such direct human terms as this, would feel that it wanted to respond in that way if it possibly could. I think one has to take one's mind back to the practicalities that were being emphasized by some people. If you take your mind back, you see, to the much smaller tragedy we faced when the East African nations were turned out of their home. We had then tens of thousands of people, only a very tiny handful. That created the most formidable problems. I believe that those problems will be repeated on a much larger scale in face of the possibility of 3.25 million people from Hong Kong.
But given that the government's role in these matters and in others is to lead, would it not be incumbent on you, if this view that we've expressed here, and it's been a Gallup poll which has come up with very similar results, very even balance, isn't it incumbent on you, as it were, to seek to reflect that apparent tolerance rather than to shut it off with the view that apparently you believe the members of Parliament would hold if you sought to modify the law to let those people in?
One has to reflect all the factors, and I fully understand the extent to which people would like to reach out in this way. I fully understand.
Is a change possible?
I think one's got to think very, very deeply before one contemplated that possibility. But the fact is, you see, if one looks at the whole problem, and Martin Lee raised a matter in a rather different sense. He said that he didn't even think we were trying to create a future for the people of Hong Kong. I hope and believe that those with whom I've worked there over the years we've been concerned know that we have actually put all our effort and all our energy to trying to establish a future on the basis of the agreement, which was warmly welcomed by the people of Hong Kong. Now, I fully understand the point made by some later on about the extent to which the events of recent weeks have shattered a view that has built up in the last 10 years. I fully understand why people are making the bid they're now making, that we've been discussing in this programme. But I come back to the fact that for a British government and the British Parliament to accept the obligation to admit 3.25 million people is an obligation we should have to regard as realistic. I think it would be a very, very formidable step to commend that.
It would be, if I understand you correctly, unrealistic if the people of Britain were to say, no, it is not on, and then the consequences you outlined at the beginning were to follow. If, however, your judgment became that those problems would not inevitably follow, if the people of Britain shared the view that it was intolerable to contemplate what might happen to the people of Hong Kong, I put it to you that you would be under some obligation to reconsider your judgment.
I think that the position is one that we have, of course, to consider and reconsider the whole time. I come back to the fact of our immense and intense concern with the future of this territory and the people who live there. But one has to try and put it in the broader perspective without being driven to the commitment that you're trying to
I don't seek to drive you particularly to commitment, just to establish exactly what your position is. Would it not be an astute judgment to make that the best possible time to make any commitment, any ultimate guarantee, which you hope will not have to be honoured because you hope the Chinese government will return to civilized behaviour again, to make that judgment now and not perhaps down the road when things are much worse, when the prospect of social disorder within Hong Kong itself may be even more intense?
I think that there are 2 points to pick up in that sentence you put to me. One is the recurrent phrase, make a judgment and an offer, which you hope will not have to be fulfilled. Every time the question is put on that basis, it is being put literally and directly on an irresponsible basis. One cannot make the change on the basis that it may not have to be fulfilled. And that was a point accepted by people in Hong Kong as well as here. If one is approaching the question on the footing that any undertaking might well, would have to be fulfilled, then I'd suggest to you that now is actually not the best time to be contemplating it, because now is a time when we're all deeply shocked and appalled by what's happened in Peking. And we need to spend some time looking at it in a rather longer perspective. I fully understand the sense of shock and dismay that is prevalent now, and I share it. But I don't think that it's the right time to make a fundamental change of judgment of that sort. The judgment that's still being upheld, the case that I'm putting, you see, is the one that commended itself clearly to Parliament 8 years ago. It's remained in place and largely unquestioned until now. I see why it's questioned now. I don't think now would be the right time to reach a conclusion in the opposite direction.
If you persist in the judgment because you believe it's the correct judgment, then down the road you also face the prospect that if you are wrong, if things turn out badly, then people could end up in Hong Kong in the same condition as we were horrified by when it happened in Peking. Not attractive for you to contemplate as a civilized human being, obviously, but possible for you to contemplate?
Grossly unattractive. The fact, of course, is that Hong Kong, in the years that have passed since the end of the war, has been confronted with possibilities of that kind very closely and very directly.
But you have the possibility, as the Foreign Secretary, to offer the sanctuary which would make that possibility an impossibility.
I'm afraid it would not do that, you see. The fact is that if you were to make the offer on the basis you're commending, on the footing that it's intended to provide a refuge for 3.25 million people, it's an offer that simply could not be fulfilled in those terms. I fully understand, totally understand the dismay, the anguish, the shock, the horror.
Forgive me, Sir Geoffrey, that is a point which you've properly made on several occasions in this interview. I want to put this final point to you, briefly. If the worst comes to the worst, then this government, you as Foreign Secretary, not you as an individual, as a Foreign Secretary, down the road may witness the worst coming to the worst. Would not that be a matter of shame for you and for the British nation, were that to happen?
When one faces questions of this kind, one obviously recognizes the scale of the hazards and the horrors that have to be taken into account. I believe that it's right for us to go on working now to try and restore the prospects that were open to the people of Hong Kong, difficult as that may be, before we come to a conclusion in the opposite sense from that I've been arguing for.
Sir Geoffrey, thank you for coming here this evening, and thank you too to our contributors from Hong Kong and to our audience in this studio, because there we have to suspend this debate. I say suspend because there can be precious little doubt after what we've heard here this evening that this is the beginning, not the end, of this grave matter. Good night.
香港市民嘅行動提出一啲睇法，仲舉李卓人為例，話香港某啲人喺戒嚴期間去到天安門